In a quiet suburban neighborhood, nestled between rows of neatly trimmed houses and white picket fences, lived Mark Thompson. Mark was the kind of guy who took immense pride in his home, especially his front lawn. Every weekend you could find him outside, mowing the grass, pulling weeds, or planting fresh flowers along the edges. His yard wasn't just a patch of green, it was his sanctuary, a place where he could escape the stress of his 9-to-5 job and feel a sense of accomplishment. Neighbors often complimented him on how beautiful it looked, and Mark couldn't help but smile every time someone noticed. But one day, everything changed. The peace that Mark cherished so much was shattered by an unexpected and infuriating problem. It all started when Karen Wilson, a woman known throughout the neighborhood for her loud opinions and bossy demeanor, decided that Mark's lawn was now her personal shortcut. Karen had been living in the area for years and was infamous for being the self-appointed enforcer of the Homeowners Association, HOA. She prided herself on making sure everyone followed the rules, even though she rarely seemed to follow them herself. One sunny afternoon, as Mark sat on his porch sipping lemonade, he heard the familiar rumble of an engine. At first, he thought nothing of it, until he saw Karen's SUV swerve off the road and onto his pristine lawn. Her tires crunched through the grass, leaving deep tracks behind. Mark froze, watching in disbelief as Karen drove across his property like it was part of the street. When she reached the end of his yard, she turned sharply, circled back around, and drove off without so much as a glance in his direction. Mark stood up, shaking his head. Surely this was a one-time thing, right? Maybe Karen was in a hurry or didn't realize what she was doing. He told himself not to jump to conclusions, but the next day it happened again. And the day after that. Before long, driving across Mark's lawn became a daily routine for Karen. Each time, her massive SUV left ugly tire marks that dug deeper into the soil, killing patches of grass and turning parts of the once lush lawn into muddy eyesores. 2. First, Mark tried to be patient. After all, confrontation wasn't really his style. He figured Karen must have had a good reason for using his yard as a shortcut. Perhaps she was avoiding traffic congestion at the cul-de-sac entrance. Or maybe there was some misunderstanding about the layout of the neighborhood roads. Whatever the case, Mark decided to approach her politely and explain the situation. One evening, as Karen stepped out of her car, Mark walked over with a friendly smile. "Hey, Karen," he began, trying to keep his tone light. "I've noticed your car has been driving across my lawn lately. I was wondering if we could talk about it." Karen barely glanced at him before responding. "Oh, don't worry about it," she said dismissively, waving a hand. "It's no big deal. Besides, it's easier for me to cut through here than go all the way around the cul-de-sac." Mark blinked, taken aback. "Easier for you?" he repeated. "But it's damaging my lawn. Those tire tracks are killing the grass." Karen shrugged, unfazed. "Grass grows back," she replied curtly. "Look, I'm not going to change my route just because of a little dirt. You'll survive." With that, she turned on her heel and headed inside, leaving Mark standing there, speechless. Over the following weeks, Mark made several more attempts to reason with Karen. He sent polite text messages reminding her to stay off his property. He left handwritten notes taped to her door, explaining how much effort he put into maintaining his yard. He even brought up the issue during an HOA meeting, hoping someone else might intervene. But nothing worked. Karen either ignored him completely or brushed him off with vague excuses. What made matters worse was that Karen seemed to enjoy pushing boundaries. If Mark complained too loudly, she'd retaliate by parking her car directly on his lawn overnight, or revving her engine extra loud early in the morning. She acted as though she owned the place, treating Mark's property like it was public land rather than his private space. The rest of the neighborhood began to take notice. Some neighbors sympathized with Mark, whispering words of support whenever they passed by. Others, however, sided with Karen, claiming Mark was making a mountain out of a molehill. "It's just grass," they'd say. "Why don't you let it go?" They didn't understand how much the lawn meant to him, not just as a piece of property, but as a symbol of hard work and dedication. As the days went by, Mark grew increasingly frustrated. He felt powerless against Karen's stubbornness and entitlement. No matter what he did, she refused to respect his wishes. The damage to his lawn worsened, with entire sections turning brown and patchy. Rainstorms only made things worse, washing away chunks of soil and creating muddy trenches where vibrant green grass used to thrive. Despite his growing anger, Mark tried to remain calm. He reminded himself that losing his temper wouldn't solve anything. Instead, he spent hours brainstorming solutions, searching online forums for advice and consulting gardening experts on how to repair the damage. Yet none of these efforts addressed the root of the problem, Karen herself. Little did anyone know Mark's patience was wearing thin. He knew he couldn't continue letting Karen trample over his property without consequence. Something had to give, and soon. Mark's frustration had reached its boiling point. Every attempt to resolve the issue with Karen had failed, and his once beautiful lawn was now a patchwork of muddy trenches and dead grass. He felt like he was trapped in an endless cycle of damage and repair, with no end in sight. The more he tried to reason with her, the more Karen seemed to dig her heels in, treating his property as if it were her own personal highway. Something had to change, and fast. Late one night, after another long day of futile arguments and futile attempts to salvage his lawn, Mark sat at his kitchen table, staring blankly at the wall. His mind raced with ideas, some reasonable, others increasingly outlandish. He knew he couldn't keep going like this. If Karen refused to respect his property, then maybe it was time to make her think twice about using it altogether. But how? He needed something clever, something subtle, something that would send a clear message without crossing any lines, or at least not too many. As he scrolled through the internet, searching for inspiration, Mark stumbled upon an advertisement for retractable metal spikes designed for driveway security systems. These devices were typically used to prevent unauthorized vehicles from entering private driveways or parking lots. They worked by remaining hidden beneath the surface until pressure activated them, causing sharp spikes to protrude and puncture tires. The idea intrigued him. What if he could adapt this technology for his lawn? At first, the thought seemed absurd. Burying spikes in his yard? Wasn't that taking things too far? But the more Mark considered it, the more appealing the plan became. It wasn't malicious, he reasoned. It was self-defense. After all, Karen had shown zero regard for his property, despite countless warnings. If she insisted on treating his lawn like a shortcut, then perhaps a little deterrent was exactly what she needed. Besides, if executed carefully, the spikes would be invisible to anyone looking at the lawn. Only someone driving over them would trigger the mechanism. Feeling a mix of excitement and nervousness, Mark decided to move forward with his plan. Early the next morning, before anyone else in the neighborhood was awake, he drove to a local hardware store and purchased everything he needed: metal spikes, small PVC pipes to house them, and tools to dig discreet trenches in his lawn. Back home, he spent hours meticulously installing the system, burying the spikes just below the surface of the soil so they wouldn't be visible unless you knew exactly where to look. To ensure the setup blended seamlessly into the landscape, Mark covered the trenches with a thin layer of dirt and sprinkled fresh grass seed on top. From a distance, the lawn looked untouched, as though nothing unusual had been done to it. Satisfied with his handiwork, Mark stepped back and surveyed the scene. To anyone passing by, including Karen, the yard appeared perfectly normal. But beneath the surface lay a hidden trap, ready to spring into action the moment someone dared to drive across it. Despite his confidence in the plan, Mark couldn't shake the feeling of unease that lingered in the back of his mind. He knew what he was doing was risky. If Karen discovered the spikes, or worse, if she got hurt, he could face serious consequences. The HOA might fine him, his neighbors might turn against him, and there was even a chance he could get sued. Yet, as much as these thoughts weighed on him, Mark convinced himself that the ends justified the means. This wasn't about revenge. It was about protecting his property and standing up for himself in a situation where no one else seemed willing to help. That evening, as he prepared for bed, Mark found it hard to sleep. His mind kept replaying the events of the past few months: Karen's arrogance, his failed attempts to reason with her, and now this drastic solution he'd devised. Part of him wondered if he was making a mistake, but another part couldn't wait to see how Karen would react when she finally encountered the consequences of her actions. For better or worse, tomorrow would bring answers. The next morning, Mark woke up early, unable to contain his curiosity. He peeked out the window, scanning the street for any sign of Karen's SUV. The neighborhood was quiet, bathed in the soft glow of dawn. Everything seemed normal, or at least as normal as things could be given the circumstances. As the hours passed, Mark went about his usual routine, trying to act casual while secretly anticipating the inevitable showdown. By mid-afternoon, the tension in the air was palpable. Mark had almost started to doubt whether Karen would show up at all when he heard the familiar sound of her engine approaching. Peering through the curtains, he watched as her SUV turned onto his street. His heart began to race as Karen slowed down near his house, hesitated for a moment, and then, just as she always did, swerved off the road and onto his lawn. For a split second, time seemed to stand still. Then came the unmistakable pop of deflating tires. First one, then another, followed quickly by the remaining two. Karen slammed on the brakes, her car lurching to a stop in the middle of Mark's yard. She jumped out, her face a mixture of shock and fury, and stared down at her flattened tires in disbelief. "What the?" she shouted, stomping around the vehicle. Her eyes darted toward Mark's house, narrowing suspiciously. "What did you do?" she screamed, pointing an accusatory finger in his direction. Mark stayed calm, stepping outside with a neutral expression. "I'm not sure what happened," he said evenly, though inside he was fighting back a grin. "Maybe your tires are old, or maybe you hit something sharp." Karen didn't buy it for a second. "You did this," she snapped, storming toward him. "This is sabotage. You're going to pay for this," Mark shrugged, feigning innocence. "I don't know what you're talking about," he replied coolly. "But maybe next time you'll think twice about driving across someone else's property." With that, he turned and walked back inside, leaving Karen fuming on his lawn. Though he knew this wasn't the end of the conflict, he couldn't deny the sense of satisfaction washing over him. For the first time in months, he felt like he had the upper hand, and deep down, he hoped this would finally teach Karen a lesson she wouldn't soon forget. Mark's frustration with Karen's relentless disregard for his property only deepened as the days turned into weeks. Each morning, he would wake up hoping that maybe, just maybe, Karen had finally realized the error of her ways and stopped driving across his lawn. But each time he stepped outside, he was met with the same disheartening sight: fresh tire tracks marring the once pristine grass, turning it into a patchwork of mud and dead patches. It wasn't just an inconvenience anymore. It felt like a personal affront to everything Mark valued about his home. The damage to his lawn went beyond aesthetics. Every rut left by Karen's SUV made it harder for new grass to grow, especially during rainy seasons when water pooled in the trenches and washed away topsoil. What started as small scars on his yard quickly spiraled into large, unsightly craters that seemed impossible to repair. Mark spent countless weekends trying to fix the mess, filling holes with dirt, reseeding bare spots, and laying down straw to encourage regrowth. Yet no matter how much effort he poured into restoring his lawn, Karen's next visit undid all his hard work in mere seconds. What made matters worse was Karen's growing audacity. At first, she had been content simply cutting through his lawn as a shortcut. But as time went on, she began pushing boundaries in ways that were both infuriating and baffling. On one occasion, Mark woke up to find her SUV parked diagonally across his front yard overnight, an act so brazen that it left him speechless. Another time, she revved her engine loudly early in the morning, clearly intending to disrupt his peace. These actions weren't just careless. They were deliberate provocations, designed to assert dominance over Mark and his property. Despite his mounting anger, Mark tried to remain calm and rational. He knew losing his temper wouldn't solve anything. It might even make things worse. Instead, he doubled down on his efforts to address the issue diplomatically. He sent polite text messages reminding Karen to stay off his lawn, though she rarely responded. When she did reply, her answers were curt and dismissive, often accompanied by sarcastic comments like, "Relax, it's just grass." Mark also reached out to other neighbors, hoping someone could mediate the situation or at least offer moral support. Some expressed sympathy but admitted they didn't want to get involved in what they saw as a petty squabble. Others shrugged off the problem entirely, saying things like, "It's not that big of a deal," or "Just let it go." A few even sided with Karen, arguing that Mark was being overly sensitive and should focus on more important issues. Their indifference stung deeply, leaving Mark feeling isolated and unsupported. Even involving the Homeowners Association, HOA, proved fruitless. Mark attended several meetings, presenting photos of the damage and explaining how Karen's behavior was affecting his quality of life. While some board members nodded sympathetically, others dismissed his concerns as trivial. One member, an older man named Mr. Peterson, actually defended Karen, saying, "She's just trying to save time. Can't you see why it's easier for her to drive across your lawn than go around?" Mark couldn't believe what he was hearing. How could anyone justify destroying someone else's property for the sake of convenience? He argued passionately, pointing out that Karen's actions violated basic principles of respect and common decency. But his pleas fell on deaf ears. The HOA ultimately decided not to take any formal action against Karen, citing a lack of clear rules prohibiting her behavior. They suggested Mark install physical barriers like fences or bollards to deter future intrusions, a solution that seemed impractical given the layout of his yard. Frustrated and defeated, Mark returned home after yet another unproductive meeting. As he stared at the muddy trenches crisscrossing his lawn, he felt a wave of helplessness wash over him. No matter what he did, whether it was talking to Karen directly, seeking help from neighbors, or appealing to the HOA, he couldn't seem to find a resolution. The problem wasn't going away, and neither was Karen. Desperation began to creep in. Mark found himself obsessing over potential solutions, spending hours online researching ways to protect his property. He considered installing motion-activated sprinklers that would spray water whenever a vehicle entered his yard, hoping the surprise might deter Karen. He thought about planting thorny bushes along the edge of his lawn, creating a natural barrier that would be difficult to cross. He even entertained the idea of setting up cameras to document Karen's transgressions, though he worried about invading her privacy or escalating the conflict further. But none of these ideas felt quite right. They were either too costly, too impractical, or too risky. And deep down, Mark knew that Karen wouldn't back down easily. If anything, she seemed to thrive on resistance, using every challenge as an opportunity to double down on her behavior. She viewed Mark's complaints as a personal attack, and her determination to win this battle only grew stronger with each passing day. As tensions escalated, so did the toll on Mark's mental health. He found it increasingly difficult to relax at home, constantly bracing himself for the sound of Karen's engine rumbling onto his property. Sleep became elusive, interrupted by thoughts of retaliation or worst-case scenarios. Even simple pleasures like enjoying a cup of coffee on his porch were tainted by the looming threat of another confrontation. His once beloved sanctuary had become a source of stress and anxiety. One evening, as Mark sat alone in his living room, he allowed himself to vent his frustrations aloud. "Why does she have to make this so hard?" he muttered, pacing back and forth. "I'm not asking for much, just a little respect. Is that really too much to ask?" His voice echoed in the empty house, underscoring the loneliness of his struggle. For all his attempts to reason with Karen and rally support from others, Mark realized that he was fighting this battle largely on his own. The neighborhood that had once felt like a tight-knit community now seemed fractured, divided by differing opinions about who was in the right. Friends who had initially offered words of encouragement began to distance themselves, unwilling to take sides in what they saw as a never-ending feud. And yet, despite the overwhelming odds stacked against him, Mark refused to give up. Something, inside him, the same stubborn streak that drove him to maintain his lawn with such care, kept pushing him forward. He knew he couldn't continue letting Karen trample over his property without consequence. There had to be a way to reclaim control, to send a message loud and clear that enough was enough. That night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, inspiration struck. An idea formed in his mind, half-formed and risky, but undeniably intriguing. It was bold, perhaps even reckless, but it carried the promise of finally tipping the scales in his favor. For the first time in weeks, Mark felt a flicker of hope and a renewed determination to fight back. Whatever happened next, he vowed to stand his ground and protect what was rightfully his. The sound of Karen's deflated tires echoed through the neighborhood, drawing immediate attention from nearby residents. Within minutes, curious neighbors began to gather, their eyes wide with a mix of concern and intrigue. Some stood on their porches, while others wandered closer to get a better look at the scene unfolding in Mark's yard. It wasn't every day you saw someone stranded in the middle of a lawn with 4 flat tires, and certainly not Karen Wilson, who was usually so self-assured and untouchable. Karen, meanwhile, was livid. Her face flushed red as she paced around, her immobilized SUV, muttering under her breath and occasionally shouting expletives loud enough for everyone to hear. She kicked at the dirt in frustration, sending small clouds of dust swirling into the air. The once pristine vehicle now sat helplessly on its rims, looking more like a beached whale than a symbol of suburban status. "Who does this?" Karen bellowed, glaring accusingly at Mark's house. "This is ridiculous. This is vandalism. Someone is going to pay for this." Mark watched calmly from his doorway, arms crossed over his chest. He didn't say a word, letting Karen vent her anger without interruption. Deep down, he knew exactly what had happened, but outwardly, he maintained an air of nonchalance. Phew. Anyone watching, it almost seemed plausible that this could have been a freak accident, a stray piece of debris or some unseen hazard lurking beneath the grass. After all, how would anyone know about the hidden spikes unless they were told? Few neighbors approached cautiously, offering tentative words of support, or perhaps just trying to diffuse the tension. One elderly woman named Mrs. Harper stepped forward, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. "Oh dear," she said softly, peering at the damaged tires. "That must have been quite a shock." Karen whirled around, pointing dramatically at the car. "A shock? A shock? This isn't just a flat tire, Mrs. Harper. Someone sabotaged my vehicle." Her voice rose sharply, causing several people to take a step back. "And I know exactly who's behind this." All eyes turned toward Mark, who hadn't moved from his spot near the doorway. He met their gazes steadily, refusing to flinch under the weight of suspicion. Karen marched up to him, jabbing a finger in his direction. "You think you're so clever, don't you?" she spat. "Well, let me tell you something. This isn't over. You've gone too far this time, Mark Thompson. Too far." Mark raised an eyebrow, feigning confusion. "I'm sorry your tires are ruined, Karen," he said evenly. "But I honestly don't know what happened. Maybe you should check your insurance policy." The sarcasm in his tone wasn't lost on Karen, whose expression darkened further. "Don't act innocent with me," she snapped. "We both know you had something to do with this. Nobody else has a reason to mess with my car." She paused, scanning the crowd of onlookers. "And if anyone here thinks this is okay, then they're complicit, too." Her dramatic declaration earned mixed reactions. Some neighbors shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact, while others exchanged knowing glances. A younger man named Jake chuckled quietly, earning a sharp glare from Karen. "What's funny about this?" she demanded, turning her wrath on him. Jake shrugged, unbothered by her ire. "Nothing, really," he replied with a smirk. "Just karma, I guess." The comment sent a ripple of laughter through the group. Much to Karen's dismay, she threw up her hands in exasperation. "Unbelievable," she muttered. "Absolutely unbelievable. Fine, laugh it up. But when I report this to the HOA, and believe me, I will, you'll all regret standing by and letting this happen." With that, Karen stormed off to call roadside assistance, leaving her SUV stranded in Mark's yard. The spectacle had drawn a larger crowd by now, including parents with kids and even a couple of teenagers filming the chaos on their phones. Conversations buzzed among the spectators, ranging from sympathetic remarks about Karen's predicament to outright admiration for Mark's bold move. As the initial excitement began to die down, Mark retreated inside, closing the door behind. him. Though he felt a sense of triumph, he also knew this wasn't the end of the ordeal. Karen wasn't the type to let things go easily, and her threat to involve the HOA was troubling. Still, for the first time in months, he felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps this incident would finally make her realize the error of her ways, or at least force her to reconsider using his lawn as a shortcut. Over the next few hours, a tow truck arrived to haul away Karen's SUV, and the crowd gradually dispersed. Life in the neighborhood returned to its usual rhythm, though whispers about the incident continued to circulate. By evening, nearly everyone had heard about what happened, and opinions were divided. Some praised Mark for taking a stand against Karen's entitled behavior, while others criticized him for resorting to such extreme measures. Either way, the story became the talk of the town, dominating conversations at dinner tables and coffee shops alike. Karen, for her part, wasted no time following through on her promise to escalate the matter. The very next day, she filed a formal complaint with the HOA, accusing Mark of deliberately damaging her property. She presented photos of her flattened tires and insisted that he be held accountable for his actions. Her argument was passionate and persuasive, painting herself as the victim of a calculated attack. When the HOA board convened to discuss the issue, tensions ran high. Members debated whether Mark's actions constituted reasonable self-defense or reckless retaliation. Evidence was scarce. There were no witnesses to confirm or deny Karen's claims, and the spikes themselves remained cleverly concealed beneath the surface of the lawn. Without concrete proof, the board found itself stuck in a stalemate. In the end, however, public opinion played a significant role in swaying their decision. Many board members had grown weary of Karen's domineering attitude and frequent complaints about trivial matters. They recognized that her repeated disregard for Mark's property rights was unacceptable, and that her behavior had likely provoked the situation. After much deliberation, they issued a ruling. Karen was formally warned to cease using Mark's lawn as a shortcut and advised to respect private property boundaries moving forward. Failure to comply would result in fines and potential legal action. Though the outcome was far from ideal for Karen, it marked a turning point in the neighborhood dynamic. For the first time, someone had successfully challenged her authority and won. Embarrassed and humiliated, Karen begrudgingly accepted the ruling, though she made it clear that she considered the matter far from settled. She vowed to keep a close eye on Mark and his activities, hinting ominously that she wouldn't hesitate to retaliate if given the chance. Despite the lingering tension, peace slowly returned to the neighborhood. Mark repaired his lawn, removing the spikes and replanting fresh grass where the damage had been done. He took extra care to restore its former beauty, determined to leave the conflict behind him. As weeks passed, Karen kept her distance, steering clear of his property entirely. Whether out of fear of another mishap or genuine remorse, she stopped driving across his lawn altogether. For Mark, the victory was bittersweet. While he was relieved to reclaim his space and regain a sense of normalcy, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that he'd crossed a line. The spikes may have solved one problem, but they had also opened the door to new complications. Still, as he stood on his porch one evening watching the sun set over his newly restored lawn, he allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. Sometimes, he thought, unconventional solutions were necessary to protect what mattered most, even if they came with risks and consequences. As the weeks turned into months, life in the neighborhood began to settle back into its usual rhythm. The drama between Mark and Karen had faded from the forefront of everyone's minds, though it remained a topic of occasional gossip during morning coffee runs or evening strolls. Neighbors who had once taken sides in the conflict now seemed eager to move on, brushing off the incident as just another chapter in the ongoing saga of suburban living. For Mark, however, the aftermath was more complex, a mixture of relief, reflection, and lingering unease. Karen kept her promise to avoid Mark's lawn, but her resentment simmered beneath the surface. She no longer drove across his property, nor did she park her SUV on his grass overnight as she had done before. Instead, she took long detours around the cul-de-sac, muttering under her breath about unreasonable neighbors whenever she passed by. Her behavior toward Mark became frosty at best. She avoided eye contact, ignored his polite greetings, and occasionally shot him icy glares from across the street. It was clear that she hadn't forgiven him, and probably never would. Despite her outward compliance with the HOA ruling, Karen wasn't one to let things go quietly. She began dropping subtle hints to other neighbors, planting seeds of doubt about Mark's character. At first, these comments were veiled and harmless, remarks like, "Well, I suppose some people will do anything to protect their precious lawns," or, "It's funny how quickly tempers flare over something so small." Over time, though, her words grew sharper, painting Mark as someone who was unapproachable and overly defensive. Some neighbors dismissed her grumbling as sour grapes, while others started to question whether Mark's actions had been justified after all. A few even suggested that perhaps he had gone too far by burying spikes in his yard, regardless of how frustrated he'd been. These whispers reached Mark eventually, carried by well-meaning friends who warned him to tread carefully. While most of the community still supported him, the cracks in public opinion left him feeling uneasy. Mark tried not to let Karen's passive-aggressive tactics get to him. He focused instead on restoring his lawn to its former glory, pouring hours of effort into nurturing the patches of grass that had been damaged during the conflict. He planted new flowers along the edges, installed decorative stones to create a clearer boundary between his property and the road, and even added a small wooden sign that read, "Please respect our yard." The message was gentle, yet firm, a reminder not just to Karen but to anyone else who might be tempted to cut corners, that his space was off limits. The transformation of his lawn became a source of pride for Mark once again. Passers-by often stopped to admire the vibrant green blades and colorful blooms, complimenting him on his hard work. Children from the neighborhood sometimes played near the edge of his property, giggling as they chased butterflies or rolled toy cars along the driveway. These moments reminded Mark why he cared so much about his home, not because it was perfect, but because it represented stability, effort, and a place where good memories could take root. Still, there were nights when Mark lay awake, replaying the events in his mind. He couldn't help but wonder if he'd handled things differently, whether the situation might have ended without retaliation. Would a calmer approach have worked? Could he have found a way to resolve the issue without resorting to such an extreme measure? These questions haunted him, not because he regretted standing up for himself, but because he knew that every action carried consequences, even those meant to defend what was right. One afternoon, as Mark watered his newly planted flower beds, he noticed Karen walking her dog down the sidewalk. She paused momentarily, staring at his yard with an unreadable expression. For a brief moment their eyes met, and Mark felt a pang of awkwardness. He considered breaking the silence, offering a friendly wave or a neutral comment about the weather. But before he could act, Karen turned away sharply, tugging her dog along with her as if determined to avoid any interaction. It was then that Mark realized something important. This wasn't just about him and Karen anymore. Their conflict had become a microcosm of larger tensions within the neighborhood, a clash of personalities, priorities, and values. Some residents valued rules and order above all else, while others believed in flexibility and compromise. Some saw property lines as sacred boundaries, while others viewed them as mere suggestions, and in the middle of it all stood Mark, caught between wanting to preserve his peace and navigating the delicate social dynamics of his community. Over time, however, the neighborhood began to heal. People grew tired of dwelling on old grievances and focused instead on building stronger connections. Block parties and holiday gatherings brought neighbors together, fostering a sense of camaraderie that transcended past disputes. Even Karen softened slightly, though she remained distant from Mark. She attended a summer barbecue hosted by Mrs. Harper, bringing a plate of cookies and engaging in light conversation with a few attendees. Though her interactions were guarded, they marked a small step toward reconciliation. For Mark, the experience taught him valuable lessons about patience, perseverance, and the importance of finding balance. He learned that standing up for yourself didn't always mean winning. It meant knowing when to hold your ground and when to extend an olive branch. He also discovered that sometimes unconventional solutions were necessary to address extraordinary problems, but they came with risks that required careful consideration. By the end of the year, Mark's lawn had fully recovered, looking healthier and more vibrant than ever before. The scars of the conflict had faded, replaced by fresh growth and renewed energy. As he stood on his porch one crisp autumn evening, watching leaves drift lazily to the ground, Mark felt a deep sense of gratitude for his home, for his resilience, and for the quiet beauty of ordinary life. And as for Karen, she continued to live across the street, her presence a constant reminder of the challenges Mark had faced. But now, when she walked by his house, she kept her gaze fixed straight ahead, avoiding even a glance at the lush expanse of green that stretched invitingly before her. Whether out of respect, fear, or sheer stubbornness, she had finally learned to stay off his lawn.